The fluorescent lights on the 42nd floor hummed at 2:17 in the morning when Raymond Carter saw it through the glass walls, a sight that ripped open 3 years of buried grief. Veronica Chase, the 32-year-old CEO whose face graced magazine covers, slumped in her leather chair, head tilted at that wrong angle, left arm dangling limp, mouth drooping on one side. Raymond's mop clattered to the floor. He knew those signs. His wife had looked exactly like that the night she collapsed in their kitchen while he was working his second shift. The facial droop, the arm weakness, the confused stare at nothing. The night the ambulance came 12 minutes too late. Now his hands were already moving toward the locked door because he recognized every single symptom of a stroke, the ones he'd memorized too late to save the woman he loved. The security system would log this moment. Janitor enters restricted executive floor without authorization. But Raymond had stopped thinking about rules. He had exactly 10 minutes to save her life or live with another death on his conscience. What he didn't know was that breaking through that locked door would crack open both their worlds, and what the most powerful woman in the city would discover about the invisible man who cleaned her floors would change everything she thought she knew about the meaning of success. Raymond's master key didn't work on executive offices. He grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall mount and swung it against the glass door. The sound shattered the silence of the empty floor. Alarms would come soon, security would come soon, but none of that mattered. He stepped through the broken glass, already pulling out his phone to dial 911. His voice stayed steady as he gave the address, floor number, symptoms. Stroke, facial droop on the left side, arm weakness, approximately 2 minutes since I found her. We need an ambulance now. The operator kept him on the line, but Raymond had already moved to Veronica's side, tilting her chair back carefully, checking her breathing, her pulse. 3 years ago, he'd frozen in panic when he found his wife. He'd wasted precious seconds trying to wake her, shaking her, calling her name. By the time he'd thought to call for help, the golden hour was already slipping away. He wouldn't make that mistake twice. Raymond loosened the silk scarf around Veronica's neck, checked the time on her desk clock. 2:18. He positioned her on her side, the recovery position they'd taught him in the CPR class he'd taken 6 months after the funeral, the class he'd forced himself to attend, even though every minute felt like penance. Veronica's eyes fluttered, unfocused, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "Don't try to talk," Raymond said quietly. "Help is coming. You're going to be fine." He didn't know if that was true. He didn't know if the ambulance would make it in time, but he knew the sound of his voice might be the only anchor she had in the confusion of her brain misfiring, neurons dying by the thousands with each passing second. So he kept talking, kept his hand on her shoulder, kept checking his watch. 3 minutes, 4 minutes. The elevator chimed in the distance. Paramedics or security? It didn't matter which arrived first. The paramedics burst through the stairwell door at minute 6, equipment cases clattering. Raymond stepped back immediately, giving them space, answering their rapid questions. "I found her at 2:17, called immediately. Left-sided facial droop, left arm weakness, slurred speech attempt, no seizure activity. She's breathing, pulse steady but rapid." The lead paramedic glanced at him with something like respect. "You did good, real good." They had her on a gurney within 90 seconds. IV line in, oxygen mask secured. Raymond watched them wheel her toward the elevator, and only then did he notice the blood on his hands from the broken glass, the way his legs had started shaking, the security guards converging from 2 directions with hands on their radios. The head guard, a man named Phillips who'd worked the building for 15 years, took one look at the broken door, the fire extinguisher on the floor, Raymond's bleeding hands, and the paramedics disappearing into the elevator. "Carter," he said slowly, "you better have a hell of a story." Raymond did have a story, but he was too tired to tell it. He let them bandage his hands in the security office while they reviewed the camera footage, let them write up their incident report while the adrenaline drained out of his system and left him hollow. The building manager arrived at 3:30, still in his bathrobe, ready to fire someone. But Phillips showed him the footage. The moment Raymond spotted Veronica through the glass, the way he'd moved without hesitation, the calculated efficiency of the rescue. He saved her life, Philip said flatly. Broke protocol, broke a door, probably broke a dozen regulations, but he saved Veronica Chase's life. The building manager watched the footage 3 times, his expression shifting from anger to uncertainty to something Raymond couldn't quite read. Finally, he turned to Raymond. "Go home, Carter. We'll figure this out later." Raymond nodded, collected his coat from his locker, and left through the service entrance as the sun started rising over the city, turning the glass towers into pillars of gold he'd never quite be able to touch. He made it home just as Cassie was waking up, her hair a wild tangle, her dinosaur pajamas wrinkled from sleep. She was 8 years old and too smart for her own good, with her mother's eyes and her mother's way of seeing through him when he tried to hide things. "You're home early," she said, climbing into his lap at the kitchen table. "Did something happen?" Raymond wrapped his arms around her, breathed in the smell of her strawberry shampoo, and wondered how to explain that. He'd just relived the worst night of his life while trying to rewrite the ending. "Someone at work got sick," he said finally. "I helped her until the ambulance came." Cassie studied his face with those 2 knowing eyes. "Like Mama?" The question hit him in the chest. "Yeah, baby, like Mama. But this time, I was there in time." Cassie nodded against his shoulder, and Raymond realized his hands were shaking again. "Did you save her?" she whispered. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "I hope so." The call came 3 days later, while Raymond was scrubbing the lobby floors on the ground level, his new assignment after the incident. The building manager had decided that keeping him away from executive floors was the safest administrative solution until they figured out what to do with an employee who'd broken $1,000 worth of safety glass and violated security protocols to save the company's CEO. Raymond's phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Carter?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Angela Ross. I'm calling on behalf of Veronica Chase. Ms. Chase would like to meet with you if you're available. She's been released from the hospital and she'd very much like to thank you personally." Raymond's grip tightened on the phone. She was alive. She'd survived. Yes, of course." They arranged for him to come to her private residence that Sunday afternoon, an address in a part of the city where Raymond had only ever driven past on his way to somewhere else. Sunday arrived too quickly. Raymond borrowed a decent shirt from his neighbor, dropped Cassie at her grandmother's house, and took 3 buses to reach the address he'd been given. The building had a doorman in a uniform nicer than anything Raymond owned. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, and Raymond felt like he'd stepped into a world that existed only in magazines. Veronica Chase stood by the windows, and she looked different than she had on that office floor. Smaller somehow, more human. Her face pale but composed, a cane resting against the nearby chair. "Mr. Carter," she said, and her voice was steady despite the slight slowness in her speech, the residual effects of the stroke. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. Can I get you anything?" Raymond shook his head, perched on the edge of an expensive sofa that probably cost more than 3 months of his rent. "How are you feeling?" he asked, because he didn't know what else to say. Veronica smiled, slightly lopsided but genuine. "I'm alive, which according to my neurologist is something of a miracle. They said another 5 minutes and I'd have had massive permanent damage. Another 10 and I wouldn't have survived at all." She moved slowly to the chair across from him, lowered herself carefully. "You knew what you were looking at. The paramedics said you called it in perfectly, positioned me correctly, gave them exactly the information they needed. They said most people panic, waste time, call the wrong number. You didn't." Raymond stared at his hands, the cuts from the broken glass still healing. "My wife," he said quietly. 3 years ago. I came home from my shift and found her on the kitchen floor. I didn't know what I was looking at. I shook her, tried to wake her up, wasted 6 or 7 minutes before I called for help. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of understanding. "I'm so sorry," Veronica said finally, and she sounded like she meant it. You saved me because you couldn't save her. Raymond nodded. I took a CPR class after, learned all the signs, all the protocols, memorized everything. I don't know what I thought, that it would make a difference somehow. He looked up, met her eyes. I'm glad I could help. I'm glad you're okay. Veronica leaned forward, her expression intent. Mr. Carter, Raymond, I need you to understand something. I was in that office at 2 a.m. because I'm always in that office. I built my company from nothing, worked 18-hour days for 10 years, sacrificed everything for success. She paused. I don't have friends. I don't have family. I have employees and board members and investors. When I woke up in that hospital, the only person who'd been with me in the ambulance was a stranger I'd never met. Do you know what that feels like? Raymond thought about coming home to Cassie every morning. The way she wrapped her arms around his neck, the drawings she taped to the refrigerator. No, he said honestly, I don't. Veronica stood, walked to the window, leaned on her cane. My mother died when I was 16. Stroke. I was taking the SATs that day, the most important test of my life, I thought. She called me 3 times. I didn't answer because I was in the testing room, because I wasn't allowed to have my phone on, because following the rules mattered more than anything else. Her voice cracked slightly. She died alone on our kitchen floor while I was filling in bubbles with a number 2 pencil. She turned to face Raymond. After that, I promised myself I'd be so successful that her death would mean something, that I'd prove she didn't sacrifice everything for nothing. She paused. But you know what I realized in that hospital bed? I've become exactly what I was afraid of. I've built an empire, and I'm completely alone, just like she was. Raymond didn't know what to say to that. He thought about all the nights he'd worked his janitorial shift, cleaning offices for people who'd never look at him twice, and how he'd never once felt invisible because Cassie was waiting for him at home. I want to do something for you, Veronica said abruptly. I know you probably don't want money, and I respect that. But I have resources, connections, opportunities. Your daughter. Cassie, right? Angela mentioned you have a daughter. Raymond stiffened. How do you... I asked about you, Veronica said simply. The building manager told me you work 2 jobs, that you're raising her alone, that you're... She paused, choosing her words carefully. That you're struggling. Please don't be offended. I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to help. Raymond stood up, felt the familiar pride rising in his chest. The pride that had kept him going through 3 years of barely making rent. We're fine, he said, more sharply than he intended. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I didn't save your life because I wanted something from you. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Veronica studied him for a long moment. I know, she said finally. That's exactly why I want to help. Raymond left the penthouse feeling unsettled. The envelope Veronica had pressed into his hands before he could refuse sat heavy in his jacket pocket. He didn't open it until he was on the bus home. Inside was a check for $20,000 and a handwritten note. For Cassie's education fund, not charity, investment. Invest in her the way you invested those 10 minutes in saving my life. Please. Raymond stared at the check. At the amount that would cover 2 years of the private school Cassie's teacher had recommended, the school she'd mentioned once and never brought up again because she knew they couldn't afford it. He thought about his pride, about what his wife would have wanted, about the expression on Veronica's face when she'd talked about her mother dying alone. By the time he reached his stop, he'd made a decision. He'd cash the check, put the money toward Cassie's school, and that would be the end of it. A single transaction, a debt repaid, nothing more. But it wasn't the end. 2 weeks later, Angela called again. Ms. Chase wanted to know if Cassie might be interested in a day at the Science Museum. Veronica was a major donor. She had access to private tours, and she thought Cassie might enjoy it. Raymond's first instinct was to refuse. But then Cassie came home from school talking about the solar system project she was working on, her eyes bright with excitement, and Raymond heard himself saying yes before he could think better of it. The museum visit was supposed to be 2 hours. It turned into 4. Raymond watched from a careful distance as Veronica, still moving slowly, still leaning on her cane, listened to Cassie's endless questions about Mars and asteroids, and whether there might be aliens living in the ice moons of Jupiter. Veronica didn't talk down to her, didn't simplify her answers, treated Cassie like her questions mattered, and Cassie, who'd been so quiet since her mother died, lit up like Raymond hadn't seen in 3 years. On the drive home, Veronica had insisted on having her driver take them. Cassie fell asleep against Raymond's shoulder, exhausted and happy. Veronica sat across from them in the spacious back seat, watching them with an expression Raymond couldn't quite read. "She's remarkable," Veronica said quietly. "She asked me about my company, about what I do. When I told her about the technology we develop, she asked if it could help people who can't walk. Not, does it help? Could it? She's already thinking about solutions." Raymond looked down at his daughter's sleeping face. Her mother was like that, always trying to fix things. Veronica was quiet for a moment. "I never wanted children," she said finally. "I told myself it was because of my career, because I was too busy, because I had too many responsibilities. But the truth is, I was terrified of failing the way I failed my mother, of being unavailable when it mattered most." She met Raymond's eyes. "Watching you with Cassie, you're present. Even when you're working 2 jobs, even when you're exhausted, you're there. That's not something money can buy." The visits became regular after that, though Raymond couldn't quite figure out how it had happened. Veronica would invite them to gallery openings, museum exhibitions, concerts in the park, always events she had tickets to anyway, she'd say, always casual, never pushy. And Raymond found himself saying yes more often than no, because Cassie loved it. And because, if he was honest, he was starting to see past the billionaire CEO to the woman who'd lost her mother the same way he'd lost his wife. They never talked about that night in the office. It hung between them like shared scar tissue, understood but unspoken. Instead, they talked about art and science and Cassie's school projects, about the small moments that made up a life instead of the big dramatic ones. Veronica started working shorter days, started showing up to their weekend outings looking less exhausted, less haunted. And Raymond noticed the way she looked at Cassie sometimes, with a longing so acute it made his chest ache. 6 months after the stroke, Veronica invited them to dinner at her penthouse. Not a public outing, not a museum or a park, her private space. Raymond almost said no, felt the familiar discomfort of accepting too much, of letting their worlds overlap in ways that felt dangerous. But Cassie begged, and Raymond was weak when it came to his daughter's happiness. So they went. The table was set simply. No staff, no formal service, just 3 places and food that Veronica had clearly cooked herself, even if it was slightly overcooked pasta and slightly burnt garlic bread. "I'm not good at this," Veronica admitted, laughing at herself. "I usually have a chef, but I thought it would be nice to just—" She trailed off, looking uncertain in a way Raymond had never seen her look before. Cassie filled the awkward silence immediately. "It's perfect, Miss Veronica. My dad burned stuff all the time, too." They ate dinner like a family. And Raymond tried not to think about how strange that was. But Cassie didn't see the strangeness. She chatted about her science project, asked Veronica about her work, and at one point reached across the table to squeeze Veronica's hand when Veronica mentioned feeling tired. "You should rest more," Cassie said seriously. "My teacher says rest is when your brain fixes itself." Veronica's eyes went bright with tears she didn't let fall. "You're right," she said, her voice thick. "That's very wise." After dinner, Cassie fell asleep on Veronica's couch. Raymond moved to wake her, but Veronica touched his arm. "Let her sleep a little longer. I need to talk to you." They stood by the window, the city lights spreading out below them. "I've been thinking," Veronica said slowly, "about what my therapist said after the stroke. She asked me who I'd call if I had an emergency, who would sit with me in the hospital, who would care if I disappeared for a week." She laughed, but it was hollow. "I didn't have an answer, not one real answer. My assistant would notice eventually. My board would panic about the stock price, but nobody would actually care about me as a person. She turned to face Raymond. And then I met you and Cassie, and I realized what I've been missing. Not success, not achievement, connection, family. Raymond's chest tightened. Veronica, I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I know this is probably strange, but if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to be part of Cassie's life, formally, like a godmother. She faltered, suddenly vulnerable. I'd like permission to care about her, about both of you. Raymond thought about the last 3 years, about the loneliness he'd buried under exhaustion, about the way Cassie had started smiling again since Veronica came into their lives. Okay, he said quietly. Yes, but on one condition. Veronica looked at him warily. You stop trying to fix everything with money. Cassie doesn't need a benefactor. She needs someone who shows up, someone who's present. Can you do that? Veronica's expression crumpled with relief. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I can do that. The months that followed settled into a rhythm Raymond couldn't have imagined. Veronica came to Cassie's school events, sat in the audience at her science fair presentation, cheered louder than anyone when Cassie's solar system model won second place. She cut her work hours from 80 a week to 50, then to 40. Started saying no to board meetings that ran past 6, started prioritizing dinners with Raymond and Cassie over networking events. But the past had a way of catching up. The call came on a Tuesday evening while Raymond was making dinner. Veronica sitting at their small kitchen table helping Cassie with her math homework. Angela's voice was tight with stress. Veronica, I need you. The Chen deal is falling apart. They're asking for you specifically. They want to renegotiate tonight. Raymond watched Veronica's face close off, the CEO mask sliding into place. When? They're here now. They said it's now or never. Veronica looked at Cassie, bent over her worksheet. She looked at Raymond, who was carefully not looking at her. Tell them I'm unavailable, Veronica said finally. Richard will have to handle it. Veronica, this is a $300 million deal. And this is my family dinner, Veronica interrupted quietly. Tell them I'll call tomorrow. Goodbye, Angela. She hung up and Raymond saw her hands shaking slightly. Cassie looked up. Was that important, Miss Veronica? Veronica smiled, genuine and warm. No, sweetheart. This is important, she pointed at the worksheet. Now show me number 7 again. But later, after Cassie was in bed, Veronica stood at Raymond's kitchen window. I'm terrified, she admitted. What if I'm making a mistake? What if I lose everything I built? Raymond came to stand beside her. What if you gain something better? What if it's not enough? Raymond thought about the night he'd found her in that office. Who you were was dying, he said gently. Maybe who you're becoming gets to live. The anniversary of the stroke arrived without fanfare. Veronica showed up at his apartment that evening with takeout and a nervous expression. I went back today, she said, to the office, to the exact spot where I collapsed. How did it feel? Like visiting a crime scene, like seeing the chalk outline of who I used to be. Cassie, listening quietly, put down her fork. Miss Veronica, do you remember when you asked me what I wanted to be when I grow up? Veronica nodded. I said I wanted to be like my dad, someone who helps people even when nobody's watching. She reached across the table and took Veronica's hand with one of hers, Raymond's hand with the other. I think you're like my dad now, too. You help people. You help me and Daddy. Veronica's face crumpled. Tears slid down her cheeks. Because somebody sees you, Raymond said quietly. Because you're not alone anymore. For the following month, Veronica made an announcement that shocked the business world. She was stepping down as CEO, transitioning to chairman of the board and establishing a foundation focused on stroke awareness and support for single parents. At the press conference, a reporter asked, Ms. Chase, what prompted this decision? Veronica glanced at Raymond and Cassie, standing off to the side. A year ago, she said clearly, I nearly died at my desk because I'd convinced myself that work was more important than life. I was saved by someone I'd never noticed before, someone whose name I didn't know. She paused. He taught me that the most important things in life are the ones we overlook when we're too busy chasing success. So yes, I'm stepping back, not because I'm weak, but because I finally understand what strength actually means. The foundation launched 3 months later. Raymond tried to avoid the gala, but Veronica asked directly, and he couldn't say no. He rented a suit, helped Cassie into her dress, and tried not to feel like an imposter in the ballroom filled with New York's wealthiest philanthropists. Veronica found them immediately, pulled them to the front table, introduced them to governors and senators as my family. The evening culminated with Veronica unveiling the foundation's name, the Second Chance Initiative, with its first program being the Carter Family Scholarship. Raymond felt the room tilt. Veronica, you can't. I already did, she said calmly. You saved my life, Raymond, literally and figuratively. You showed me what I'd been missing. You taught me that being present matters more than being powerful. She reached for both their hands. I'm not trying to buy your affection. I'm trying to honor what you gave me. A second chance to live a life that actually means something. Raymond looked at Cassie's awestruck face, at the woman who'd become family. Okay, he said finally. Okay. Years passed. The foundation grew. Raymond thrived in a new position, director of operations. Cassie grew into a confident teenager who wanted to study neuroscience. The three of them became inseparable. Family by choice, bound together by crisis and sustained by genuine affection. On Cassie's 16th birthday, they threw a party at Veronica's penthouse, warm and lived in now, with photos everywhere and Cassie's artwork on the walls. After the guests left, Veronica pulled Raymond aside. I have something for you, she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a photograph, the security camera footage from that night, his face frozen in the moment he'd spotted her through the glass, the exact second he'd made the choice to act. I've looked at this 1,000 times, Veronica said quietly, trying to understand what you saw in that moment. Raymond stared at the photograph. I saw someone who deserved to live, same as anyone else. Veronica's eyes filled with tears. That's the thing you never understood about yourself. You see worth in people even when they can't see it in themselves. That night, Raymond found Veronica looking at his photo wall, pictures of his wife, of Cassie growing up, of the three of them together. I love that you kept her pictures up, Veronica said. She's part of this story, too. They stood close, and Raymond felt the shift in the air, something that had been building for years. Veronica stepped back carefully, creating distance. We should probably talk about this, she said quietly, about what we are to each other. Friends, Raymond said. Family. The people we call at 3 a.m. Veronica smiled, relief evident. Yes, exactly that. I don't want to complicate it. Me, neither. What we have is too important to risk. The conversation settled something between them, an acknowledgement of love that existed without needing to change its shape. They were bound together by trauma and healing, by the deliberate choice to build something new from wreckage. It wasn't romantic love, but it was no less deep. They were each other's proof that life could surprise you, that the worst moments could lead to the best ones. That family was something you created, and that was enough. Raymond Carter had broken through a locked door to save Veronica Chase's life, but the real rescue had taken years, had involved trust and vulnerability and the slow dismantling of walls. He'd been a janitor who noticed a CEO in distress. She'd been a billionaire who learned to value invisible people. Together, they'd created something neither could have built alone. A family forged not from blood, but from the deliberate choice to care, to invest in each other's healing, to show up week after week, because that's what love meant. Tomorrow, he'd go to work. Veronica would call, Cassie would complain about homework. Their ordinary, extraordinary life would continue. But tonight, Raymond allowed himself gratitude for the training that prepared him, for the courage that pushed him through that door, for the woman worth saving, for the daughter who taught them what mattered, for the improbable family they'd become. He'd saved Veronica's life that night on the 42nd floor. But what happened next? The slow building of trust, the creation of family, the choice to let joy back in that had saved them all. That was the real miracle. Not the dramatic rescue, but the quiet decision to keep showing up, to keep caring, to keep building something beautiful from the pieces of what they had lost. Sometimes the most important moments of your life come disguised as ordinary choices. Raymond Carter was just a janitor working the night shift. He wasn't supposed to be on the 42nd floor. He wasn't supposed to notice the CEO slumped in her chair. He wasn't supposed to break through that locked door. But he did. Because 3 years earlier, he'd failed to save his wife. He'd wasted precious minutes not recognizing the signs of a stroke, not knowing what to do, not being prepared. And when he saw those same signs in Veronica Chase, the facial droop, the arm weakness, the wrong angle of her head, he had a choice. Let the past define him, or let it teach him. He chose to act. What Raymond didn't know was that breaking through that door would crack open both their worlds, that the woman he saved would become family, that his daughter would find a godmother in a billionaire CEO. That grief could transform into something beautiful if you let the right people in. Veronica had built an empire but lived completely alone. Raymond had survived tragedy but isolated himself in exhaustion. Both of them were drowning in different ways, until a random Tuesday at 2:17 in the morning brought them together. This story isn't about a dramatic rescue. It's about what happened after. The slow building of trust, the deliberate creation of family, the choice to show up week after week, because that's what love actually means. It's about understanding that heroism isn't one big moment, it's 1,000 small ones. Cutting work hours to make a school play, choosing family dinner over a $300 million deal. Letting someone see your scars and trusting them not to look away. Raymond saved Veronica's life in 10 minutes, but they spent years saving each other. Like if this story touched your heart. Comment, have you ever been the person who showed up for someone when it mattered most? Subscribe to my story box for daily stories about second chances, unexpected families, and the courage to keep showing up tomorrow. Another story about the invisible people who change our lives.